Hey guys, I'm Shane from Motion Academy, and today we're going to talk about how to create a clay material inside of Blender procedurally, and we're going to animate it. So you can add this to any object in your clay motion scene, so let's get right into it. So first of all, we're going to fire up a new Blender scene, and we're going to delete everything in the scene. One thing to note is that we can use this shader both in Cycles Render and EV Render, but for this tutorial specifically, we're going to shift into Cycles Render, and we're going to create a template scene so we can visualize our material more easily. We're going to add some lights. Going to increase the intensity of these lights so we can see the shadow areas and the light areas more visibly. I'm going to add a camera object. Gonna hit 0 to jump into the camera view, camera to view, and we're gonna place the camera in a place where we can see our sphere clearly. It doesn't have to be perfect, as long as you see our material in the middle of the screen, that'll be okay. Perfect. So now we have the lights, and I would like to kind of reduce the shadows a little, increase the shadows a little bit. Great. Now that we have this, our template scene is done. Now we jump into our shadings tab, and we select our sphere, create a new material, name it matte.clay, and now we have our default node, which is printable BSDF, and our material output. So now let's go into our rendered view to visualize this. So now, to create our surface unevenness that clay materials usually have, we have to kind of play around with the normal maps and kind of get that effect rather than actually sculpting the object to give that effect. So we're gonna add a Voronoi texture, and let's visualize our Voronoi texture by plugging into the base color. So this is what we have, and our main texture that's going to give this clay effect is going to be the Voronoi texture. So this is what we're going to base our entire material around. So to kind of play around more with the controls of the blacks and whites of this texture, I'm going to add a color ramp, and I'm going to bring the blacks somewhere here. I'm going to make this B-spline, go back into Voronoi texture, make this 3D to 4D, F1 fine, Euclidean, normalize, scale, we're going to drop it down to 3, and right away you can see that this is kind of the flat surfaces that we're looking for, but it's not quite there. And also, we plugging this into base color, it does not give us the ability to manipulate the surface of the object. So what we have to do is maybe plug this into normal. Nope, does not work. To fix this, I'm gonna add a bump node and plug this into height, and right away you can see our Voronoi texture is in action, but still this is not what we want. So while this being our main texture, we have to add more textures on top of this and more details on top of this, and play around with the parameters to get the clay effect. So to start off with, I'm gonna create a mapping node by pressing Ctrl T. For this, you need to activate your Node Wrangler add-on by going into Preferences. Any Blender version has this, by the way, so no worries on that. And then I'm going to organize my node setup a little bit. I'm going to bring all this a little bit further away, hit Ctrl J so I can add a frame. I'm going to rename this frame as main noise. I'm going to add a color. Great. And I'm going to bring these here. Right. So now we'll have to multiply this texture with some other textures, which is first we're gonna multiply this with a noise texture, and sorry, this has turned off. Okay, now we can see how the multiplication works here. Once again, to get more control, I'm gonna add a color ramp and bring the white somewhere here and the blacks somewhere here. Once again, change into B-spline. In noise texture, we're gonna change this to 4D. We're gonna normalize it. Scale is gonna be 3 or 3.5. Detail's gonna be 2. Let's take our roughness to 0.4. Laterality 2, distortion. Okay, this is great. And for this texture too, we're gonna hit Control T and get the node wrangler mapping set up. Great. And I'm gonna select all of these, Control J to add another frame. Rename this as noise 2. Add a color. Great. And again, we're gonna multiply. But this time we're gonna multiply with this exact setup. I'm gonna duplicate that. I'm gonna change the color. I'm gonna rename this as noise 3. I'm gonna bring the color into the multiplication, and in the color ramp I'm going to bring the blacks somewhere here and the whites all the way to the left corner, so we get this subtle details of the Voronoi texture. It kind of negates each other and gives us the kind of prominent areas of the texture, and this is what we need. We don't need very sharp edges, which is very unrealistic, but this works very well. We can see the imperfect zones and the details. So now, this is great, but in a clay texture there's still some kind of minor details that makes it look like clay. So for that, once again we're gonna move it a little bit to the right, and we're gonna add another math node, keep it at add. We're gonna create a noise texture. We're gonna plug the factor into the add. This is not what we want. We're gonna add a color ramp here. We're gonna bring the blacks over here, the whites. Whoops, the whites very close here. We're gonna keep the scale, sorry, 80. Detail at 2, roughness 0.5, laterality, everything's good. Add Control T. So these two nodes in all of these textures, I know it's not useful yet, but when we come to animating the texture, it's gonna be useful. So we're gonna keep it here for now, and we're gonna touch on it a little bit later. So now if you zoom in, you can see this slight grain effect on your material, but you can see these holes are going inside of the material. We don't want that. We need it to come out, so we're going to invert the texture, so now it comes out. Great. This is great. We're going to keep it like this. So most of our work when it comes to creating the clay material is done, but there's a little bit to be done to sell the clay effect. So before we start, I'm going to organize this node setup a little bit more. And I'm gonna toggle viewport denoising. And now, if I want to customize my node setup, and if I want to change the scales of these noises, I have to go through one by one of these nodes and change the scale value, and I don't want to do that. So In order to counter that, I'm going to add a value node and plug the value node into all of these scale inputs. So that way, if I change the value node, it will change the scales of all of the noises. That's great. I'm going to keep it at 3. And lastly, I'm going to add some details to the roughness map. So for that, I'm going to take the color output of the main noise and I'm going to plug it into a RGB into black and white, because it outputs a RGB value and we don't want that, and I'm going to input that into a color ramp and bring it into the roughness. And right away you can see some reflectivity in our object, which is not what we want. We need it to be more matte looking, so we're going to bring the white towards the black color. And great, this is perfect. So in terms of practical usage, let's add another object into our scene. We can see our reference character, which doesn't have any materials yet. So we're going to copy this material, our created clay material, into our character. We're going to copy it into all of our objects. And right away you can see that his mouth has more details than his body, and his eyes too. To fix that, we're going to go into our material shading tab. We're going to select our mouth or our body. So we're going to have to create separate materials to all these separate objects. So we are going to duplicate this clay material and name this matte clay body. And now we can take use of the value node we created, and we have to increase this value to get those details. There we go. And let's do the same thing to the mouth. We're going to duplicate this material. We're going to rename this as mouth. And we have to reduce this value. So we reduce the scale of the details. And we can copy this same material we used for the mouth to the eyes. And it will have reduced details as well. I think this is a bit too much still, so we'll duplicate it again. Eyes. And copy that material into all the eyes. Reduce it. There we go. So now we have a functional clay shader, which you can use in any object in your clay motion scene. Next, we have to animate this clay shader to give life into this shader, which we are going to do in our next episode. We're going to talk about how to manually animate the clay shader so you can have more control over it, and we're going to talk about how to automate the clay shader animation, and we're going to talk about how to deform clay objects so you can give life into this clay shader in many ways and still have control over it. So I hope you guys enjoyed this tutorial, so like and subscribe and stay tuned for more. I'll see you guys in the next video. See you, bye bye.